The Pillar of Autumn in Halo Combat Evolved will always be a special mission, as it's the one which started everything. Nowadays, after 5 mainline games and numerous spin-offs, it may not seem quite as exciting as it did some 20 or so years ago, but the way it so effortlessly introduces both the world of Halo and many of the mechanics the series still uses to this very day means it certainly hasn't lost any of its charm. And in this video, I'm going to try and explain why it's such a brilliant opening to the series. The Pillar of Autumn begins with a view of the titular Halo itself, which I think you'll agree is rather appropriate given the name of the game, before the camera pans up to the enormous human ship the level is named after, where the first ever mission in the series takes place. Something Bungie really focuses on for the duration of the level is building up the Covenant as an extremely threatening enemy, and this begins right off the bat through the dialogue between Cortana and Keyes.
So, where do we stand?
Our fighters are mopping up the last of their recon picket now, nothing serious. But I've isolated approach signatures for multiple CCS-class battle groups, making 3 capital ships per group. And in about 90 seconds, they'll be all over us.
Well, that's it then. Bring the ship back up to Combat Alert Alpha. I want everyone at their stations.
Everyone, sir?
Everyone.
And in general, I think this short cinematic does an excellent job of setting the scene while avoiding any long bouts of exposition, something you'll see Bungie avoid throughout Combat Evolved's campaign. You know there's a mysterious ring world floating in space nearby, you know that the Pillar of Autumn and the humans on board it are isolated from the rest of humanity, and you know that the Covenant are about to attack the ship, and that's about all you really need to know before you get cracking. There's a nice touch shortly after involving Johnson's speech, which will change depending on whether you're playing on easy or normal, or on heroic or legendary. This change is of no real consequence, but considering Halo both begins and ends on the Pillar of Autumn, featuring a scene in both involving Johnson that changes depending on what difficulty you've selected is a nice touch which helps further align the two missions. After Johnson's speech, it's time for the Master Chief himself to be thawed out so that you can get used to the game's most basic mechanics, namely movement, aiming, health and shields. The way they are introduced is definitely worth noting. Rather than being explained to the player unimaginatively through a list of long text boxes or similar, although it is worth noting that that does still happen a little more than I'd like, everything is explained entirely in-world. Using the right stick to look around is necessary so that a calibration reading can be taken from your battlesuit's diagnostics, and your health meter appears when your systems are bought online. You're then encouraged to get used to movement using the left stick by taking a walk around the diagnostic bay. An optical diagnostic station is used to ensure your controls are configured correctly, and you finally head to the energy shield test station, which shows you exactly how the recharging shield mechanic works. This last test was particularly important at the time, as recharging health mechanics were not the mainstay of first-person shooters that they are these days. Indeed, it was Halo which popularised the concept to begin with, but it should also be noted that the brief movement and aiming tasks were fairly important too. Halo was by no means the first game to put movement on the left stick and aiming on the right, but it was still something very new, and the FPS genre at the time, at least on consoles, wasn't the juggernaut it is in the present, so a huge percentage of players would likely never have experienced such a control system before. By including these quick and easy tests straight off the bat, Bungie ensured that every single player had a working knowledge of the controls they'd need to succeed, and introduced them in a way that they became part of the story and didn't slow down proceedings too much. It may not be that exciting now practically every modern video game uses a similar introduction, but at the time it was still a very novel feature. Moments after getting to grips with everything, you catch your first glimpse of the Covenant.
Bridge to Cryo 2, this is Captain Keyes. Send the Master Chief to the bridge immediately.
Captain, we'll have to skip the weapons diagnostics
On the double, crewman.
Aye, aye, sir. The skipper seems jumpy. We better get moving. We'll find you weapons later.
Okay, I'll leave the self-diagnostics running at least. Oh god, they're trying to get through the door! Security! Intruders in Cryo 2! Please don't!
Sam! Sam! Come on, we've got to get the hell out of here.
After which you have to jump over a pipe to progress, forcing you to utilise another part of Halo's movement, similar to later in the mission where you have to crouch to move under a set of blast doors. During the next few sections, you're forced to move through the autumn unarmed while evading groups of Covenant. I mentioned earlier that Bungie is keen for you to see them as a threat from Combat Evolved's outset, and I think this section is an important part of doing that. You often only catch glimpses of them in the shadows, which definitely helps them seem more threatening, and even though it's practically impossible to actually be killed during this segment, the various NPCs which do bite the dust do a good job of highlighting just how much of a threat your new enemy poses to regular humans. Of course, you are no normal human, and small Covenant squads like the one you run into will soon pose no problem, but putting you on the back foot even for just a few moments is a wise decision by Bungie, as it helps you build a healthy amount of respect for the Covenant before you later begin shooting your way through wave after wave of them. Reaching the bridge, Captain Key's taskmaster chief with escorting Cortana off the Autumn and stopping her from falling into the Covenant's hands at all costs.
Which is where you come in, Chief. Get Cortana off this ship. Keep her safe from the enemy. If they capture her, they'll learn everything. Force deployment, weapons research. Earth.
I understand.
At which point you're finally given a weapon and it's time to get shooting. You don't have to just shoot the Covenant either. You can also immediately go rogue and become the enemy of humankind.
What the hell are you doing?
Security to the bridge. The Master Chief has gone rampant. Take him down, boys.
And I like that Bungie accounted for this, even if it is only a small addition. As you might expect, your first proper encounter with the Covenant is a relatively easy one, as you take on a trio of grunts before things get a little trickier. Choosing the mess hall as the setting for your second encounter was without doubt a deliberate one on Bungie's part. Firstly, because it gives you time to fight your first elites from a distance so you don't get too overwhelmed early on, and second, because it helps continue to create something of a difficulty curve as you move from encounter to encounter. You've already fought a pack of grunts, a simple opening challenge, and now you're fighting grunts and elites in a larger area while being backed up by Marines, a slightly tougher challenge. Immediately after, you'll take on the same enemies again, but in close quarters, which is what you'll then do for a little while, before taking on the mission's final challenge, which is doing the same but with some verticality thrown in as well. Continuing your escape, you get a chance to melee an elite from behind, which demonstrates how powerful the attack can be and also reminds you that it's something you can actually do, although there will be another opportunity to do this later on where the game prompts you to do so just in case you didn't get the hint the first time, and that is swiftly followed by this.
Get up so I can kill you again! What the hell? Did something just hit us? Move in! Back to the airlock! Time you showed up.
The Pillar of Autumn does an impressive job of making it feel like you are under attack and that events are constantly changing, and it's scenes like this, the amount of NPCs which get involved, and the various other changes to the environment which really help drive that home. Another facet of the mission's design which causes a more delayed impact is its narrowness. In other parts of Halo, narrow areas tend to be preceded by or follow much wider spaces, and this helps the game flow much better and feel less repetitive. The Pillar of Autumn, on the other hand, is the only mission in the campaign which doesn't really feature any open spaces at all, which makes sense from a design perspective as it means you're better able to focus on getting used to the core mechanics without being too distracted. Whether it was intentional or not, what this also ends up doing is making subsequent missions, and especially Halo, the campaign's second mission, feel much more impressive. To begin with, Combat Evolved seems like it may not be much more than a narrow sci-fi shooter, and as such, the transition to far larger spaces as soon as the first mission ends is absolutely felt more acutely as a result. Eventually you'll make your way upstairs through the area I mentioned earlier and witness a number of lifeboats leaving the Autumn, which you watch from a window you have to directly approach to ensure you don't miss yet another example of the Covenant's brutality.
The life pods are launching. We should hurry. The Covenant are destroying the life pods. They really don't want us on that ring.
The way Bungie guides you to the window is fairly elementary game design, but I think it's worth highlighting nonetheless, as these little touches definitely all add up over the course of the game. As you reach the mission's final third, you might think there's not too much left to learn, but there's still a few new things to get to grips with before the mission concludes. First up are nav points and the flashlight.
Warning, blast doors closing. We have to use the ship's maintenance access ways. Follow the nav point, it will lead you to an opening.
Which are quickly followed by the motion tracker.
I'm detecting Covenant movement outside the access ways. Activating motion tracker. Let's find a safe exit. They're right on top of us. Let's find another way through.
In all honesty, I've always thought these sections in the maintenance tunnels slowed down the pace of things a little bit too much for my liking. Everything up until this point is frankly exhilarating, but given that it shows you how nav points work, demonstrates the usefulness of the flashlight, and allows you to observe how the motion tracker functions from a safe area, I suppose they serve enough of a purpose that you could argue that their inclusion is justified. Thankfully, once you're out of the vents, things begin to pick up again, starting with the even more obvious melee opportunity I mentioned earlier. You bash a door open first, so Bungie can ensure you've used the action at least once prior, and then you encounter a lone grunt conveniently standing with his back to you. You do also get another massive, and in my view unnecessary pop-up tutorial, which I again really don't think needed to be used considering how good a job the mission generally does of introducing you to new concepts organically, although playing devil's advocate, like the vents, you could argue that this inclusion is here for a good reason. When people talk about Halo being a revolutionary title, one of the things they will often highlight is the game's controls, and quite rightly so. Some inclusions that made them so fantastic, for example the dual stick setup and subtle aim assist, had been used by other games prior, but far less, if any, had included both dedicated grenade and melee buttons. And with that being the case, the concept of being able to whack an enemy with your gun or toss a grenade in an enemy's direction without needing to switch weapons would have felt entirely new. So in that regard, making sure even FPS veterans were fully aware of these new and exciting additions does make some sense. At some point during the Pillar of Autumn, you'll also likely hear this line.
Keep your head down, there's two of us in here now, remember?
And following the conclusion of the trilogy, I can safely say that this seemingly innocuous piece of dialogue is now one of my favourites in the entire trilogy. This first time you hear it, it wouldn't have conveyed too much beyond the idea that Cortana is startled and a little unsure of Master Chief, but following its later inclusion in Halo 3, it definitely becomes more significant. When you hear it in Halo 3, Cortana repeats the line in an almost loving tone of voice, which showed how far their relationship had come since the beginning of Combat Evolved.
Just keep your head down. There's two of us in here now, remember?
It was a brilliant idea by Bungie to include it a second time in the series, and it's a wonderful example of how one simple sentence can be used in different contexts in order to tell a story. It soon becomes apparent that the Covenant were very keen to deal with Master Chief before he awoke from cryosleep, a nice visual indicator of just how important he really is.
It looks like the Covenant wanted to catch you napping.
And from here, things begin to quickly pick up pace again as you make a final push towards the lifeboats. There's even time for one last teachable moment. As I mentioned previously, the dedicated melee and grenade buttons were a pretty big change at the time, and after giving you two opportunities to acclimatise to the new melee option, not doing the same for grenades would have been a missed opportunity. Thankfully, however, the Pillar of Autumn's final encounter ends with a bang, as you come across a pile of grenades in an area designed specifically so you can practice your throwing. There's a good number of Covenant grouped together in a tight corridor with plenty of scenery you can use as cover while you line things up, and hopefully by the time you've finished off your enemies, you should have a pretty good idea of how the grenade button works. And with one final, rather epic cutscene, the Pillar of Autumn draws to a close.
What is that thing, Lieutenant?
Hell if I know. We're landing on it.
Your Honor, she's been hit!
Knew it. The Autumn's accelerating, Keys is going in manual.
Hands up, everyone. This is it. We're entering the ring's atmosphere in 5.
Sure you wouldn't rather take a seat?
We'll be fine.
If I still had fingers, they'd be crossed.
Oh, and as far as the Anniversary Edition's graphics, my thoughts mirror those regarding most of the game's indoor sections. That is, that they have been over-designed and make the mission's environments visually feel far too busy for my liking. That wouldn't be such a big issue in isolation, but when combined with the increased amount of particle effects and similar, it feels like there's too much happening on screen in too tight a space. I do however like some of the opening scenes and the skybox as a whole, which do look pretty good, but overall it's not enough that I'd ever prefer playing the mission's Anniversary Edition over the original. I don't think there's many who would consider the Pillar of Autumn to be the greatest Halo mission ever created, but considering it's the first mission in the first game in the series, Bungie must be given a huge amount of credit for the way they subtly tutorialise the game's mechanics within a level that remains engaging from beginning to end. The Covenant assault on the ship is a visceral affair, and the encounters you face ramp up in difficulty over time to keep things interesting, and all the while, Bungie continues to drip feed you new mechanics which can then be used to your advantage as well. A lot of people playing Halo Combat Evolved for the first time may have been unsure of what exactly to expect going into the game, but by the end of the Pillar of Autumn, I'd guess most if not all of them would have been extremely excited to find out what happened next. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and do also consider supporting the channel via the Patreon link in the description, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.